Good evening. I'm Sarah Miglio, Assistant Provost at Wheaton College. This year, our community has read and discussed Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, as part of our core book program. Core book is our shared reading experience centered around a book that highlights themes from our Christ at the Core curriculum. For many of us, reading a classic text such as The Plague reminds us of how literature can serve as a mirror to reflect back to us our own experiences, revealing to us in the process something more about ourselves. And as we've navigated a year of living through the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm grateful that we've had this opportunity to step back from our present reality and contemplate what God might be asking of us in this unique moment. It's such a privilege and an honor to welcome a most distinguished alumnus of Wheaton College, Dr. Arthur Ammann. It's also a privilege to welcome another graduate of Wheaton College, Dr. Philip Ryken, the president. Both Dr. Ammann and Dr. Ryken share a deep appreciation for this particular novel, and it will be fascinating to listen in on their conversation today. Before we begin, a few words about Dr. Ammann and the significance of his work. He graduated from Wheaton College in 1958 with a BS in biology and went on to obtain a medical degree from Seton Hall College of Medicine in 1962. He's the founder of Global Strategies and clinical professor of pediatrics and global health sciences affiliate faculty member at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center. Global Strategies is a nonprofit organization founded in 1998 dedicated to HIV prevention, reducing maternal infant mortality, and educating community healthcare workers and developing sustainable models for addressing critical healthcare needs in neglected regions of the world. Dr. Ammann has had significant experience working with infectious diseases and pandemics. In 1977, his clinical trials of a pneumonia vaccine resulted in the first FDA approval of a vaccine for bacterial pneumonia and meningitis in children and adults. Then in 1982, Dr. Ammann described two of the three ways that HIV is transmitted. He's also co-authored and authored over 300 scientific papers, in addition to giving over 1,000 national and international lectures and courses on HIV and AIDS. Dr. Ammann has been sought out around the world for his medical knowledge. And in 2007, he was awarded the Wheaton College Outstanding Alumnus Award for Service to Humanity. In 2018, he was the recipient of an honorary degree in humane letters from the University of San Francisco. And he's the author of 5 books, including most recently the book Lethal Decisions: The Unnecessary Deaths of Women and Children from HIV/AIDS, which was published by Vanderbilt University Press. I think it goes without saying how much of an honor it is to welcome Dr. Ammann. And he embodies the very best of our mission at Wheaton College to train and prepare Christian liberal arts students for a lifetime of faithful service. Thank you, Dr. Ammann, and thank you, Dr. Ryken, for joining us for this conversation about Albert Camus' The Plague. I'm grateful that we have this opportunity to close our year-long conversation about the plague with the both of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miglio, for that excellent introduction. And it was a great decision for Wheaton College to use The Plague as our campus book this year. Very excited about the fact that our freshmen and other new students particularly have been studying The Plague and discussing it this year. And such a privilege to have you join me for this interview, Dr. Ammann. Thank you for making time for your alma mater today.
Well, you're very welcome.
So I love the fact that not only are you a world expert on pandemics and on the spread of disease, but also as a lifelong liberal arts learner, you've held on to your appreciation for Camus' The Plague. And I wanted to begin by asking when you first encountered the book, and what did you think of it when you first read it, and how has that had an influence on your life?
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to have difficulty talking about these things because they have been so much of my life, beginning really as a teenager. My first reading, and I've read the book 5 times, it's enduring, almost like the scriptures. You go back and you read a part of the scriptures that you've read 5 or 6 times before, and then you get new insight. But my first reading of it was as a teenager right after the polio epidemic. It affected us all in the 50s. And then it was followed by a vaccine, which ended the epidemic. And a little anecdotal piece of information here, Dr. Fauci and I happened to be raised in Brooklyn around the same time. And we both recall having the public swimming pools closed because of the polio epidemic. 30 years later, we encountered one another again for the HIV epidemic. And I wonder whether or not he has read that book and whether or not it may have influenced his decisions as well. But I wanted to understand why these infectious diseases came. And of course, there was a vaccine for polio, which ended the epidemic. So that was my first reading. And then there was a period of quiet when I went to Wheaton, the year that I graduated, 1958. But in the beginning of the year, my senior year, 1957, I hopped on a Greyhound bus from Brooklyn, New York, went to the campus and was there a short period of time when the 1957 Hong Kong flu epidemic hit. And I remember well the closing of the chapel. It was announced the chapel would close. We would meet out on the lawn at that time under the elm trees, which may not be there anymore, in order to distance ourselves from this plague that was occurring then. What happened with that plague was in 4 months period of time, due to Dr. Maurice Hilleman, he was able to isolate the virus and persuade vaccine companies to make 50 million doses of the vaccine to be available in a 4-month period of time, much more accelerated than what's happening here. But there was obstacles that occurred at that time. And so once again, I turned to the plague to try to understand the bureaucracy, the people, how things become really dependent sometimes on individuals. What happened then was a period of getting additional training, as was mentioned, medical school. When I went to accept a position as professor of immunology and pediatrics at the University of California, within a short period of time, HIV AIDS was discovered. And so again, I was introduced into this major epidemic, and I again turned to Camus' book to try to understand this epidemic, which seemed to be so full of stigma and confusion and bureaucracies. And so I had 2 companion books during that time, really, one of which was The Plague, and the other companion book, in a sense, was the Gospels, which helped me through to understand and to, I think, do the right and the ethical thing. The woman at the well, to me, became very important, John chapter 4, where Jesus really cut through all of the stigma and ministered to this woman who probably today would have been a woman with HIV, but it didn't keep Jesus from talking to her and ministering her. So that was my next reading of the plague. And again, it became something that told me about how humanity reacts to these terrible epidemics that keep recurring.
There's so many things even that brief account illustrates for us, Dr. Ammann. One is the way that the reading that you do can be a companion through life. And that's one of our hopes for our students when they become graduates, that they'll be lifelong learners, continue to draw on some of the lessons they learned during their time at Wheaton. It strikes me that as you look at the history of humanity, and now we're, I think, more sensitized to realize how many plagues have affected the human race. In one sense, there may be a lot of similarities to the course of a plague, and there's certain things that you go through, certain experiences you have anytime there's a plague. Also, each plague has its own course and can be very unique and distinctive. I mean, I think of the difference, for example, between polio and what we're going through now. Because polio had such a devastating effect on children, the fear factor of polio, what it meant for families, I think is different than this particular pandemic, which is not as severe for children. So I think you can see some similarities and some differences with the course of each plague. I'm wondering how your past experiences, and we'll circle back and talk more about Camus, but your past experiences in science and as a researcher, how have you been prepared to think about and address the current pandemic that we're having? What experiences do you bring to that understanding?
Well, a lot of my experiences derived from the plague that I was most immersed in, and that was the HIV/AIDS plague. And what I learned early on is that these plagues that come, or pestilences is another word that can be used, uh, do not begin with a catastrophic event. I mean, we're pretty good in society of responding to a tsunami or an earthquake, something that's catastrophic, a rebel attack of some sort. But these epidemics begin very slowly. They begin with one individual. And I think that's going to be a very important thing to reflect on with the COVID epidemic. You don't conquer a disease when you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people still infected. So what I saw happening in the HIV/AIDS epidemic was the extraordinary capability of science to answer the fundamental questions. What is the cause of the epidemic? What is the cause of a plague that is happening? Can we develop a vaccine? Can we develop a treatment for this? But then the ethical issues that were introduced early on, which we are seeing also in the COVID epidemic. What about justice? And what about distribution? And what about minority groups? And what about poverty? The plague has the ability to extract the weaknesses and to demonstrate to us what the weaknesses are. And it's interesting to me, I'm very conservative in terms of my thoughts about what's going to happen with COVID. I personally think it's not going to go away as quickly as people would like, because in 1981, the AIDS epidemic was discovered and the cause of AIDS in 1985. But we still have 1.5 million getting infected every year from HIV. And we have almost 1 million dying, and we have no vaccine. We've got incredible treatment. So it's a humbling experience that we have the science which can advance way beyond our capabilities to maintain our compassion and our ability to care for the people who are affected. And always, as is the discussion now with COVID, who's going to get the vaccine and how will it get to the people that really need it as well out in these very poor countries. So there's a lot of things within these epidemics that cause us to think. And if you don't think about the human side, the compassionate side, as a scientist, you just develop something that's a scientific achievement, but may not help mankind.
What was the moment for you when you realized that COVID-19 was going to be really a global crisis?
I don't think it was a single moment, but I realized that one of the things that I was doing was what I had tried to avoid doing, that I read in Camus. And I'll tell you exactly what that was. In part of the plague book, Camus says we entered the second phase of the epidemic when it had lost its fleshy substance. I can't get that out of my mind. That what I started doing was following the numbers to see where this epidemic was going to go. And all of us are familiar with the graphs that are there. Look them up instantaneously. We could do that now. But somewhere around probably April or May, I realized that this was going to be something very, very serious, and that we were underestimating what this virus was going to do. And one of the things we're underestimating was the impact on all aspects of everyone's life. It was, as Camus said, we had lost the sense, the compassionate side, and realizing how impactful this was going to be. So initially, like with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the numbers were small. But these epidemics these viruses, if you want to say, are very clever. What they do is they start off slowly, imperceptibly, one person at a time. And then all of a sudden you realize you've lost the human side of it. They're no longer people with names, but they're numbers, they're graphs. And that's when I think I realized that we really had entered the second phase of the epidemic, when it was really going to be significant.
You've done some writing on various viruses. I'm thinking, for example, of your series of essays, A Conversation with Three Pandemic Viruses. And you were just talking about how important it is to humanize the course of the disease, but actually, in effect, in these dialogues, there's a sense in which you personify the diseases themselves. Tell us a little bit about how you wrote those essays and the form that they took.
Well, somewhere around July in the epidemic, I was just overwhelmed with emails and calls, and people would stop and question me about what my thoughts were on COVID. And there were all of these rumors spreading because of our media now, most of them actually not true. So how do you sort these things out? And I got to saying to people, well, I'm not sure, but let me talk to COVID. I'm going to have a conversation with COVID tonight. So that was the evolution of the conversation with the viruses. But what I was trying to get across there is that these viruses are very serious problems, because not only do they cause death and destruction, but they cause these other issues, which, although we think viruses are biologic agents that have no thinking process, they march to their own tune and they challenge us in our responses. So the writing of those conversations with the virus is really to point out how they impact us imperceptibly initially, but also illustrate how we need to have caution in terms of what we do and how we intervene and what we must do.
One of the things I thought of in looking at those dialogues is that there's in liberal arts education, there's a long history of dialogues. One of the ways you learn is through a conversation. I mean, that goes all the way back, to Plato and Socrates. So you're standing in a long line of a tradition, not just a long line of historic viruses and pandemics, but also just a way of having a conversation that brings truth to light in a way that's compelling and interesting and really advances the cause of truth.
Now, do you think my liberal arts education at Wheaton might have had something to do with
Yeah,
that?
maybe a little bit. So what I love it when I hear from our alums that their liberal arts education is making a difference, not just in the near term. And that's a lot of times students when they're in college, they're thinking about their first job after college, but it makes a huge difference over the long term in the kinds of contributions you can make to the kingdom, kinds of contributions you can make to society. And you wouldn't necessarily think that somebody researching in the sciences is going to draw on, in very significant ways, the humanities, partly to humanize the scientific work that you do, but also to bring understanding to the scientific aspect of it. The two can be related.
Yeah. Well, if you wouldn't mind, there's a quote that I wanted to read from the book where, as you know, with the plague and Camus, there's a discussion as to whether or not this is really about the plague or it's an allegory. And my feeling, and I think the feeling of most critics, is that it was really an allegory of what was happening in France at that time. But early in the book, Camus writes, he tried to recall what he had read about. He's talking about Dr. Roux, figures that crossed his memory, and he recalled that some 30 or more plagues were known in history, and it had accounted for nearly 100 million deaths. But what are 100 million deaths? When one has served in a war, one hardly knows what a dead man is. After a while, and since the dead man has no substance unless one has actually seen him, 100 million corpses broadcast through history are no more than a puff of smoke in the imagination. Now, I find that very moving. I mean, that to me is the HIV epidemic. We have forgotten, even as we're dealing in COVID, because we're dealing with numbers, we have to personalize these things. And that conversation with the different viruses was one of my attempts to personalize it, to say these are not just viruses that we get infected with, but they cause human death and human suffering. And of course, Camus, this particular part of what he writes here is also talking about war. I happen to be, as Camus was, a pacifist, which developed at Wheaton College. I'm not sure that's part of the curriculum, but
that's one of those topics we agree to disagree about in the church and have lively discussion around.
Yeah, but became in my own profession, dealing with these epidemics and pandemics, and being a pediatrician, it seemed to me such a contrast, as Camus illustrates here, to try to save a life and then find that 10 times, 20 times the number of lives are destroyed by war. But it's really a very moving part of the book to me early on, illustrating what these epidemics mean. We have to think about them. And even today, as we talk, we're talking about 500,000 people that have died of COVID. And I want to shout out, look at the body bags, look at the people in the hospital, look at the families that are suffering. So we as Christians in our belief really believe that we have to address pain and suffering on an individual basis. The numbers are meaningful, but unless we get to the point, as Camus points out, that this is about a person, then I think we've lost the impact of what we can learn from these epidemics.
No, I agree with that. And I think, great literature gives us a window on human experience. And part of the test of the value of Camus' The Plague is whether we can find some of our own experiences and get perspective on our own experiences through reading this great literature. And Camus was really wrestling with that same question. There's a disaster on a grand scale that can be reduced, could be reduced merely to something mathematical. And actually the mathematics is very important because the progress of the disease and its exponential progression is critical to understanding the threat that's there, but you're missing the human element if you're not looking at the individual suffering of the particular person. I think when I look back on this season of my own experience, I'll be thinking about the global issues, but I'll also be thinking about people I know who died from COVID. I mean, I just think of, as one example, I have a cousin who was in Queens when things were really getting out of control there and had volunteered to help. And his assignment was to help at the morgue of a hospital. So he was confronted right away with the scope of death in a very traumatic way. I mean, that's the kind of personal impact this plague has had. And Camus saw it in his own time and wrote about it very eloquently. You know, we see it in our own time as well. I'm wondering, Dr. Ammann, if there are other either passages in the book or characters that really stand out to you when you've gone back to the book. What are some other things that stand out to you from Camus' The Plague?
Well, thank you for the question. I think one thing I realized in my last reading, which was just finished a month ago, my 5th reading of the book, was I had completely missed a very important scene that Camus painted, and that's the scene of the young boy who is admitted to the hospital. He has the plague, and gathered there are the main characters. And I don't know how I missed this because it's such an important part of the book, where after this event, everybody changed. I mean, they were in the middle of the epidemic, but everybody changed because I think it became personalized. So here's a young boy that was suffering from the plague. They decide to admit him to the hospital where the other sufferers are. And Castell, who has worked, he's given his life to developing a vaccine or a serum. And they're going to try it on this first patient, and it's a child. A little bit like Jenner's first experiment with smallpox vaccine. He picked a child. We could never do that today. But they picked this child with the optimism that maybe this would make a difference. And so they give this serum to the boy, and Camus paints this picture of the rest of the hospital ward becoming silent, as if they're waiting for the miraculous change of the serum that's going to happen. And contrary to the hopes of everyone, the boy temporarily improves and then worsens. And then the sound in the ward becomes louder and louder as other patients realize that this isn't going to work. And the boy dies. Now, who else is there? Theroux is there. Dr. Roux is there. Father Penelou is there. These are people that have been intimately involved. And when you read what Camus spells afterwards, their lives changed. And I thought it was fascinating that their lives changed because of the death of this one person. They refer to it as the death of the innocent, the death of the child, which caused them to think. And even for the priest, Father Penelou, who preached this incredible sermon, he thought at least was incredible, where he put the blame of the epidemic on the evil things that man does. He changed. He saw that he could no longer believe that, but began to believe that there was something he had to do. Dr. Roux, of course, continued in what he was doing. Theroux, who was kind of a confident, a moralist, decided that he had to go out and deal with the people and have contact with the people to help them. So everyone's life changed. They had the numbers before, but their lives and their attitudes changed only when they could make it very personal. Much like you're talking about, it's when it becomes personal, it goes beyond the numbers.
I'm wondering how you think your life has changed from your very personal encounter with HIV, I'm thinking of particularly. How has that shaped the course of your life, not just vocationally, but what difference has it made to you as a follower of Christ?
Well, it's changed like the epidemic, not dramatically, but gradually. I mean, I remember in I think it was 1984, walking into Dr. Fauci's office saying we had found the vaccine to prevent HIV. We still don't have a vaccine, but kind of the arrogance of science that we can get the answers to human suffering through science alone, and we don't. And I began to look back at my own patients and realize that what they remembered and what I remembered of so many of these tragedies and suffering was the individual association, the remembering of the person, rather than numbers. I went back frequently, as I mentioned, to the scriptures to find out how to act, what were issues of justice. Jesus in the Gospels was very clear. I mean, the answers to me are in the Gospels of how we ought to react in these epidemics. Go out, reach out, heal the leper. That was another one of the changes that Camus mentions, that they were healers that could work together. They were healers from religion. They were healers from science. That was the important thing. The discrimination, which I mentioned. So I began looking back and saying, we have these scientific accomplishments, but if we don't help the person, if we don't respond to the person themselves, then we have lost what humanity is about.
One of the things that was impressed, so I took advantage of the summer as an opportunity to read The Plague. I typically try to read our campus book every year, and helps me connect with what our students are learning. And one of the things that struck me in reading The Plague this summer was that virtually every issue that we seem to be facing with this plague in one way or another is touched on in this book. You've got the people that deny that there is a plague at all. You've got the people that are despairing and so think that nothing can be done. You have the impact that it's having on family life, how it's affecting healthcare professionals, different theological responses to the pandemic, the impact it has on athletics, on romantic relationships. I mean, just so many different aspects of life are touched on. I'm wondering if you, as you think about the way that people respond to the pandemic in the book, were there ways of thinking about or responding to a global health crisis that you think Camus missed in his book? As many things as he covered, are there ways of thinking about and responding even to our current pandemic that the plague won't help us with, and it's too bad that it doesn't?
I would agree with you. He's fairly comprehensive, and it's a hard question to see whether there was something he did not cover. Of course, in the book, there was no cure, there was no treatment of the plague. It just kind of died on its own. And he had warnings. Again, let me read one of the things that he said near the end of the book. He knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from the books, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years. It would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to a happy city. And I think that's the difficulty. We see things emerge slowly, and we don't appreciate the potential of where they're going to go. So plagues are not going to go away. I may have a very pessimistic view, but I think what he didn't cover in his book, to answer that question more directly, was where do we have to be cautious? It's an allegory, which refers to political issues and violence, but there are other things that are happening now that are very clear. If you look at the 1957 epidemic when I was at Wheaton, 50,000 deaths compared to 500,000 now. Why the difference? The population of the world has tripled since 1957. There were very few students that got onto airplanes and went to the campus. It was cars and trains. For me, it was a Greyhound bus. So there was not the transportation issue. There was not the interchange. We are now a global world, which I think Camus didn't appreciate what globalization, there was no globalization at his time. The impact that would have on fostering these viruses. HIV came from the forests of the Congo, most likely. COVID came from China, perhaps. It really doesn't make any difference where it came from. The point is we have enormous economic issues and enormous issues regarding spread of virus and incubation of virus. We have to be on guard. And how do we address that? And perhaps we can't address that fully even now. Camus certainly didn't, because I don't think at that time he realized what's going to happen to the world.
Well, the end of the book is kind of chilling, isn't it? It's a sort of warning that there will be a sequel. And I think we're at a stage now with the current coronavirus where we're very much hoping for an end to the virus, although I take your point that it may not fully end. It may be with us in the same way that HIV has been. But just that reminder that these things have afflicted humanity before, they will surely afflict humanity again. It's really a chilling way to end the book. I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you just about how Christian faith has influenced your work, but are there any other passages or themes from the plague that you were hoping we would have a chance to touch on that I didn't ask specifically about, and you'd be sorry if you missed an opportunity to read a passage or comment on it?
Well, I think the plague leaves a lot of questions, although it addresses a lot of issues. It really does not resolve certain issues. And that's the basic issue of good and evil, of why these things occur. It's alluded to, and perhaps the writer's privilege is not to address things to which there are no clear answers. These are certainly things that were discussions at late nights at Wheaton up until early mornings in the dorm, where we would discuss the fundamentals of what life is like. But to me, I think Camus did a pretty good job of raising the issues. And for me, personally, on my own belief level, I have turned to scriptures probably more now than ever before and saying, so many of the answers are here. Why are we ignoring them? And in a sense, it's the same what Camus said about, you just go to books, you can read about the plagues. And to me, we have new solutions that we keep coming up with that aren't going to help. And so I find myself going to scriptures. I do not find myself going to apps. I'm an anti-app person, especially as I become older and hear over and over again of how apps are going to solve the problem of getting vaccines to older people. The failure to recognize the human personality, that the need of meeting and the need of having compassion and of helping others, I think is a critical part of what we have to do. And so I'm moved away a little bit from science, realizing that it doesn't have all the answers, that we cannot lose the humanity side. And those teachings are clearly articulated in the Gospels. I mean, I read them over and over again, probably more now than ever, and saying, why have we turned away from so many of these issues? The compassion, the dealing with people who are suffering, the healing, the emphasis that we see there.
Well, I think you're right that existentialism, and this is an existentialist novel, does a better job of raising questions and pointing out some of the real painful dilemmas of the human experience. But we get a lot more help for life and for understanding the world from the Gospels. And I'm wondering, as a scientist, as a researcher, what are some of the ways that your Christian faith has sustained your calling over many decades now since your time at Wheaton College?
Well, a lot has been, I often find myself in the minority in terms of some of the ethical issues in medicine. We started Global Strategies for HIV prevention because it was an issue of equity and injustice, where we had developed all of these treatments, often using research patients in poor countries as research subjects. And we still do that, still happens today. So there has to be some calling to the ethical issues and to the very deep issues. So, I would say that we need to why are we afraid? I mean, this is a question for you. I'm stumbling a little bit, but I want to phrase it correctly. The question for you is, why do you think it is that we turn so much to science and move away from these very fundamental issues of what do we do about suffering and what do we do about good and evil? Is it because there are no answers to them, or because we're afraid of the answers and it's just easier to do something like develop an app or a technology that doesn't really solve the problem of what people really need?
Yeah, well, I thought I was asking the questions here, not answering the questions, but I will say this, that I think because science is so effective at providing answers to certain kinds of problems, people would like to see that, the ability of science to address human problems expand, but science can really only address scientific questions. It can't address questions of the ultimate purposes of evil. It cannot address questions of beauty and of the desires of the soul for fellowship with God. It can't provide answers to the problems of sin and atonement. So science is a beautiful and wonderful thing under the lordship of Christ within the areas where it actually is able to address issues. But part of the value of a liberal arts education like we provide at Wheaton College is we want to have an education that touches the whole person. And there's definitely a physiological, natural dimension of human experience, but there is also a spiritual, a psychological, and emotional. We're whole persons, and the Bible, wants to address the soul in a way that science never will be able to. So that would, something like that would be part of my answer to your really good question.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, my experience, I can talk to a person, parents, about the disease of the child and the treatment that we have and what's going to happen. But what they also want and they don't get is, what does this mean? I mean, why this illness? Why this suffering? To many of these things, there are no answers, but they need to be addressed. And I think we have some of the answers about the value of human life and what that means. And so if we solve all of these technical problems, but we don't address the fundamental needs, the spiritual needs of an individual, the importance of being recognized as an individual, the search for meaning, the need for love, the need for affection, the need for forgiveness, those are a part of life. They're not scientific issues. And in our world, we want to say that science has the answers. I'm not anti-science, but we can't extend science to saying that it can solve the very deep and meaningful problems that are a plague to humanity, in a sense, another form of a plague, of the needs that people have and the withdrawal of meeting those needs through solutions that just simply don't work.
Yeah, and part of the message of the gospel is that we have a Savior that entered into the suffering condition of humanity to address those ultimate issues. So that's a unique incarnational redemptive answer to the problems of humanity that no one else except Jesus Christ is able to offer. Hey, I wonder if I can ask you, this is a closing question for you. I'm thinking of our Wheaton College students especially that'll be tuning in for this interview. And I'm wondering, just reflecting back on your Wheaton experience and a lifetime of following Christ in your particular vocation scientifically, any advice or encouragement that you would give to Wheaton students about how to take best advantage of their precious years in college on the campus of Wheaton College?
Well, I would be remiss as a physician if I didn't give advice. But I am so fond of my education at Wheaton, and I look back and say, why was that? And it was because I had the opportunity to interact with the professors who were very open. I met wonderful people who I still have friends. Our best friends are still Wheaton graduates. There are fewer of them now as we get older, but we've kept in contact. And we look back and say, what to remember. I remember one meeting that we had. It was one of the returning of the alumni meeting, and we talked about what was important about Wheaton. And what fascinated me was that everyone there who spoke and kind of gave their testimony, rather than saying how they did in a course or what their profession was, they said, I met this person. I had this professor. I began to think about what was important in life. And I think that's what I would say is spend time doing that. You worry about the grades for sure. Worry about how you're doing. But unless that experience, don't miss the experience, I should say. Don't miss the experience of that interaction with professors and people that will become very meaningful. Ask the questions that trouble you and have those interchanges in those discussions. Learn and then just keep asking. Don't stop.
Dr. Arthur Ammann, researcher, expert on global pandemics, lover of literature, lifelong learner, somebody encouraging us in the scriptures and also to see the value of the individual human person, even in the great things that are happening in our world today. The things that are happening health-wise and other forms of injustice, considering the needs of the individual person, asking how we can be part of God's work in their lives. We're grateful for your example, for your love for Wheaton College, and for the generous gift of your time for this interview.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm a very privileged person.
Goodbye and God bless you.
Thank you.